All right, so the second lab for week 2 is lab 4, which we're going to be talking about the integumentary system. This is a pretty straightforward lab. Normally we do some experiments, but we're just going to skip those, just about different sensation and perception type things. So me doing them is not really going to help teach you anything. The point is for you to be able to feel things. So a video of me doing like hot and cold temperature sensing with my hands is not really gonna be beneficial at all. So we're just gonna skip them. Um, you can read through the activities in your handout and stuff though. But the quiz and final will just ask you questions on different labeling stuff with different layers of the skin, different glands and what they secrete, their functions, that type of thing. So there won't be any questions on the experiments that we're skipping. All right. So integumentary system is, I think, one of the systems that maybe is the most, I don't know, not well known for people. Basically, it just consists of your skin, hair, and nails, so stuff on the outside of your body. It's actually the largest system in the human body. It makes up for about 15% of your total body weight, which is quite a lot, especially for something that we like don't think about really having like any, substance to it. But our skin, hair, and nails, obviously, their skin covers our entire body, and it's pretty thick. It's pretty hefty. So there's a lot of different functions of our integumentary system. Obviously, our outside, the skin, is protecting our deeper tissue from injury. So we already talked about how the epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Again, it's stratified because it has multiple layers, which makes sure our deeper tissue is protected. So if you get a cut or a scrape, it's not going to damage important tissues, nerves, stuff like that that's deeper in our body. Also functions in immune surveillance and immune response. So there's some specific cell types embedded in our skin to help make sure that there's no bad pathogens or bacteria getting into our body. Synthesis of vitamin D. We have touch, temperature, and pain sensations. Thanks to our integumentary system. Obviously, these are going to be also incorporating our nervous system, but they're kind of embedded in our skin. Thermal regulation, so making sure we don't get too hot or too cold, or maintaining that homeostasis that you guys talked about in lecture. And then also the just production of sweat and oil happens in our integumentary system. Okay, so the most superficial layer of our skin, there's a few different layers, but the most superficial, so the layer of the skin that we can see, is our epidermis. Okay, so I'm sure everyone in middle school has heard friends say your epidermis is showing, right? Just the outside layer of your skin. And you can see this, all the stuff that I'm outlining up here, that's all your epidermis. So mostly just made up of stratified squamous epithelial, but there's specific layers that you guys are gonna need to know, and also specific types of cells that make up your epidermis that are really important. Okay, so the layers that you need to know, you have your stratum corneum, which is the most superficial, stratum lucidum, so this teensy layer here, this is only found in thick skin. And thick skin is on your palms and the soles of your feet. So these outer two layers are actually just dead skin cells, which we saw when we looked at stratified squamous epithelial tissue, those wispy layers near the surface. So this is just adding extra protection. Okay, so the lucidum specifically on our palms and soles of our feet, places that there is even more abrasion than other places in our body, needs this extra layer of dead skin cells just for an extra layer of protection. So stratum corneum, stratum lucidum. Next we have our stratum granulosum, which is this darker purple layer. Stratum spinosum, which is this large layer. And then the deepest layer is the stratum basale. So that's the deepest layer of our epidermis. Deep to the stratum basale, down here, we have our dermis. Okay, so beneath the epidermis is the dermis. So the deepest layer of the epidermis is stratum basale. I remember the layers, you need to know them in order from superficial to deep. I remember a little mnemonic. The first letter of the words, like spells, or not spells, a saying, like is the first letter of something in a saying. It's easy to remember. Oh my gosh, this is rough. Anyway, the mnemonic I remember is Claire likes grandma's special brownies, right? So if you remember Claire likes grandma's special brownies, you can know the first letters of the layers and then figure out corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale. Okay? Again, stratum lucidum, that second layer, is only found in thick skin. In the epidermis, there's a number of different things that we can see. All of these little purple cells are keratinocytes. Okay? Stratified squamous, but keratinized, they're called keratinocytes. Up here are the dead keratinocytes. We have dendritic cells, which are this big green spiky guy, tactile cells, this blue guy, and then melanocytes, which is this brown guy down here. And I'll talk about all of those in detail. So keratinocytes are the most abundant cell in the epidermis. In the stratum corneum and stratum lucidum, they're dead, right? Again, just adding extra protection. The keratin in these cells, all keratinocytes produce keratin. They make like a waterproofing barrier to help keep water out of these deeper cells. So keratinocytes, again, all of these purple guys, we have dead keratinocytes towards the surface and living ones that are deeper, but the most abundant in our epidermis. Okay. Melanocytes are the brown guys. These are found in the stratum basale, so the deepest layer of our epidermis. Their function is produce melanin, which is a pigment that is what's responsible for tanning your skin. So people who have darker skin tones, the reason for that is they just have more of this pigment, more melanin in their skin. So their melanocytes are more active than someone who were to have lighter skin, right? They don't have those melanin pigments in the skin. Evolutionarily, people who lived near the equator obviously were exposed to more UV light. So the melanocytes producing melanin was a way to protect those individual skins from the harmful UV light. Okay, so people towards the equator who are exposed to this UV light more have more melanin than someone who was further away from the equator, didn't see as much UV light, right? So melanin just tans the skin and helps protect it from UV light. Next, we have dendritic cells, which are these green guys. These are the immunity cells in our skin, so they help with immunity via phagocytosis. So if you have a cut and some sort of bacteria or pathogen gets into the skin, these cells will find that bacteria and kill it to make sure that it doesn't get deeper, get into your bloodstream, doesn't infect the rest of your body. So these guys are the main players in the immune response for your skin. And they're found in the stratum spinosum, which is that thick layer here. So dendritic cells, immunity cells, you can think of them as. And then the last type of cell are the tactile cells, which are in the stratum basale, so the deepest layer as well. And they're just touch receptors. So they synapse on to nerves that go to our central nervous system and help us feel things. And then the stratum basale, because you don't want them too close to the surface because then they would just be getting damaged anytime you got a little cut or little scruff or whatever it may be. So them being a little bit deeper in the skin protects them from getting destroyed as easily. Okay. So here we can see the layers of the skin again: corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale. And then there's stuff you don't need to know here, but just telling you what's in each layer. Corneum is the dead keratinocytes. Lucidum, again, dead keratinocytes, only in thick skin. Granulosum is living keratinocytes. Spinosum, living keratinocytes and dendritic cells. Stratum basale, We have basal keratinocytes, which are what's helping produce more. Melanocytes and tactile cells. So it's important that you know where the cells are at and also their function. Okay, so that's just the epidermis, the most superficial layer of the skin. Deep to that, you can kind of see it down here. We have the next layer, which is the dermis. So in this image, all of this purple stuff up is the epidermis, okay? All of this stuff, purple stuff down, but on top of the yellow stuff, this is our dermis, okay, which is the second layer of our skin. This we can divide into more layers. We have the papillary layer, which is more superficial, and the reticular layer is deeper. I remember which one's which. The papillary layer is more superficial. You see these little ridges at the top of the papillary layer? Those are called dermal papilla, okay? And these are actually really cool. They're one of my favorite parts of the whole integumentary system because these dermal papilla are what's responsible for producing fingerprints. So everyone has different shapes of these little dermal papilla, and depending on how these ridges and grooves go, will determine what your fingerprint looks like. So it's kind of cool, but if you know that the dermal papilla are at the top of your dermis, then you know that the top layer is your papillary layer. Second layer, deeper to that, is your reticular layer. Okay, within your dermis, you have a bunch of different stuff going on. You have some different types of receptors, different glands. You can see your hair follicle, lots of stuff going on, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the papillary layer and reticular layer are just the main divisions. And you should know which type of tissue each is composed of. So your papillary layer is made of loose areolar connective tissue, and your reticular layer is dense irregular connective tissue. So it's kind of hard to see, but your papillary layer, loose areolar up here. You can see the dermis, dense irregular. You can tell that this is definitely dense irregular down here in the reticular layer. Okay, you can see the epidermis up here with a stratified squamous epithelial and these dead keratinocytes at the surface, right? Those little wisps that we saw earlier. So it's important that you know the different types of tissues you can find in different areas. All right. In our skin, we have a number of different types of glands. So we have two different types of sweat glands, eccrine sweat glands, which are smaller little guys, and then apocrine sweat glands, which are bigger ones. And they both produce sweat, but for different functions, which we talk about in a second. And then we also have sebaceous glands. And sebaceous glands are what's producing oil. And typically they're going to be associated with a hair follicle, which is why if you don't wash your hair, it gets oily really fast, right? Because oils are literally being released along your hair shaft, okay? So again, sebaceous glands produce oil. So these are the different types of glands and their functions. Apocrine glands are producing sweat. There's those big guys that are producing sweat in specific areas only. So axillary, which is our armpit region, and genital areas. And they produce a kind of sweat protein fat mixture, which if you think about in these areas, your sweat is kind of stinky and a little bit gross, right? So it's not just sweat water, it's mixed with different proteins and fat. We also have a type of sweat gland, which we don't have any models of, so as long as you know the name and the function, you'll be fine. But sermoneous gland is found in the auditory canal only, and it produces a specialized type of sweat that is actually earwax. So earwax is technically sweat. Our eccrine or merocrine glands are the smaller glands in our skin. They just produce sweat all over the body. So you have eccrine glands everywhere. And they produce sweat that is involved in thermal regulation. So they're the guys that when you get hot are going to start sweating, trying to cool your body off. Okay, so these are all over the place. Just produce sweat that's like water to help cool you off. In our breast tissue, we have mammary glands. which produce, again, a specialized type of sweat, which is actually breast milk. It's kind of interesting that that's technically sweat. And then the last type of gland is the sebaceous gland, which again is producing oil. And typically when we're going to see them, they're going to be associated with a hair follicle. So they're producing oil, which is also known as sebum, which is why it's called sebaceous sebum gland. Okay, and at the end of the PowerPoint, I have a slide that shows the glands that you need to know labeled on a model. So I'll spend some time on that in a minute. So we have our epidermis, dermis here, and then the deepest layer is our hypodermis, which is made up of mostly adipose connective tissue, which is loose. So just fat, right? So deep to our dermis, we have a layer of fat in the hypodermis. All right, a few more things, and that's it for this week, or this lab. Our hair follicle, we don't have really good pictures to show any of this, so you're going to see this just in diagrams. But there's some stuff you need to know. Your hair bulb is this very bottom part of your piece of hair, right, where your hair is growing from. Your hair bulb is in the hair follicle. So your hair follicle is this outer light pink layer here. So your hair is within your follicle. Your hair root is the part of your hair that's under your scalp. Here we can see the little sebaceous oil gland associated with the follicle. Above the surface of your skin, you have your hair shaft. That's the part of your hair that you see, that you can color, you can cut that. But deep to that, you have your hair root, and then you have your hair bulb at the very bottom. With each hair follicle, you have what's called an erector pili muscle, which is the teensy tiny muscle that is what allows your hair to stand up. So if you get cold and you get goosebumps, or you get scared and your hair stands up, think of like a black cat or something when they put their hair up on their back. They can do that because of their erector pili muscle. So when these contract, it causes your hair to stand up, which is what causes goosebumps. And this is really important in thermal regulation as well. So the whole point of people's hair, or animals' hair standing up like that, is to try to provide extra warmth. Okay, so that's your hair, pretty straightforward. And then the last part of what you need to know is your nail. And again, we don't have models or anything to show this, so this would just be shown on a diagram. So the part of the nail that you would paint is called your nail body. Obviously your nail is going to grow, and the part that overhangs the white part of your nail that you would file or cut down, that's the free edge of your nail. So you have your nail body, your free edge over the edge. Underneath your skin where your nail is growing, right, deep to your skin, it's called your nail root. Okay, and your nail root grows out of what's called the nail matrix, which is this point here, which is what's producing your nail. And then the very last thing you need to know is the epichyme. This one spelling is important. That is just a fancy word for your cuticle, but you need to know epichyme because this is an anatomy class, not a, I don't know, whoever calls it cuticle, general nail person class. Okay, so epichyme is just a fancy word for cuticle. All right, so normally in lab we do an activity where we look at our fingerprints. We're not going to do this, but you do need to know that our dermal papillae are what's responsible for creating our fingerprints. And if at home you have any like an ink pad or something, or you want to take your fingerprint maybe on glass or something, you can do it just to see what your fingerprint looks like. Kind of interesting. Obviously everyone's is a little bit different, but it's kind of fun to see what your fingerprint looks like. All right, and then the last part of today, we're talk about burns a little bit. So obviously there are different severity of burns. I'm sure you've all heard of first, second, and third degree burns. The higher the number, third degree burns are the most severe. First degree burns are the least severe. And they're named based on what layers of tissue are damaged. So in a first-degree burn, only our epidermis is going to be damaged. So stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale, right? So all the layers of our epidermis are damaged in first degree. Second degree burns, epidermis is completely destroyed, and then the damage goes down to our dermis, or papillary and reticular layers of our dermis. And then third degree burn, the most severe, your epidermis is completely destroyed, dermis is completely destroyed, and your hypodermis is damaged. Okay, so those are burns. And then the very last thing here I want to show you are the model that we would ask some of this stuff on. So you can see all the stuff that we talked about. With each hair follicle, you'll have a sebaceous oil gland. So this blue lumpy thing is our sebaceous gland. We can see the small sweat glands and the large sweat glands. So again, these small sweat glands are the eccrine glands, which are really important in thermal regulation. The large ones are the apocrine glands, which are in only axillary and genital areas that produce that sweat protein fat mixture. The dermal papillae, the top layer of our dermis. Above that, we have our epidermis, right? This purple layer up here. With each hair follicle, we have our erector pili muscle, these little red muscles here. You can see the hypodermis and adipose tissue down here. And then some different sensory components that we didn't necessarily talk about. We have our Meissner's corpuscles and Pacinian or lamellar corpuscles down here. Okay, so these you'll talk more about in lecture. We don't really spend too much time in those in lab, but so make sure you're taking a look at this model. There's a PDF of it on EduCat as well for you guys to study off of. Their questions on your quiz will be asked, some of them at least, on this model. So, all right, let me know if you have any questions. That's it for this week, though. Pretty straightforward. So, yeah. Okay, bye.